Welcome to the detached observer phenomenon, which explores some of the hidden reasons why internal communications fail. It involves three dynamics which we'll explore shortly, but first of all, just what is the detached observer phenomenon and why does it matter? Well, have you ever found yourself reading an internal communication at work and at some point stopped and started thinking, hang on a minute, is this communication actually talking to me or is it talking to someone else? Because it feels like it's talking to someone else, even though I thought it was supposed to be for me. Does this sound familiar at all? Because pretty well everyone has had this experience. In fact, it happens quite a lot. And when it happens to you, what do you do with the communication in question? Switch off, perhaps? Bin it, maybe? Get on with the next thing on your to-do list, perhaps. That's what most people would do, surely, because, well, when you've got loads of other stuff to be getting on with, why would you waste your time on a communication that seems to be for other people? But why does this kind of switching off even happen? Well, it turns out that when reading anything, whether it's an email, a newspaper, or even a novel, you can do so from any one of three different perspectives or positions. None of these is necessarily right or wrong in an absolute sense, but each can affect how you respond to the words in front of you. First of all, there's the communicator position. Now, people often adopt this position when, say, filling in a survey, which might include something phrased along the following lines. I believe this company cares about its customers. Now, because this statement is written in the first person, its phraseology is designed to make you feel that it's you who's written the very words you're reading. In short, that you are the communicator, which for a survey is fine, because the business wants people to communicate their responses back. Except for surveys, though, it's rarely appropriate. Second of all, there's the audience position. In this position, you do not feel that you have written the words, but that someone else has done so, and that those words are being addressed to you. Inevitably, then, this is the position people need to be in if they're going to be taking the actions required to deliver the brand promise as a result of having read an internal communication. Because if they're not in the audience position, chances are they'll be in the detached observer position. This is the position people tend to unconsciously step into when, for example, they're on a copies list for an email. It's a fly-on-the-wall position which, when you adopt it yourself, will make you feel as if you're eavesdropping on a conversation that's going on between a communicator and an audience. The words are not being said by you nor to you. Instead, the words are coming from someone else and speaking to another someone else or to a group of others. And this is a really big deal as far as internal communication is concerned for two reasons. Firstly, when you're in the detached observer position, you'll feel that any instructions or questions in the communication are being addressed to the audience rather than you. So it's highly unlikely that you're going to do what's being asked of the audience. Now, that in itself is no big deal. However, there are 7 unconscious triggers that can push people out of the audience position and turn them into detached observers. It's these triggers that are almost always responsible for making you switch off from certain communications. Now, one of the triggers can be created through the way we identify audiences during the briefing process. The other 6 are all linguistic. And crucially, thanks largely to the emotional, audience and relationship dynamics, these triggers can do huge amounts of damage internally that they simply can't do with external comms. But why is this? Well, to understand this conundrum, let's start by imagining someone at home watching a TV show in the middle of which is a commercial break. Now, the moment the commercials start, that person will be making a decision, even if only subliminally, to either sit through the ads or pick up the remote and see what's on the other channels or go to the kitchen, get themselves a drink, whatever. The point is that if they decide to sit and watch the ads, it's entirely their choice to do so. The same is true of any ads, or editorials come to that someone chooses to read in a magazine or newspaper, and so on. And with very few exceptions, maybe screen ads at the cinema perhaps if you happen to be stuck in the middle of the row, marketing communications and PR comms are read, watched or listened to only by people who have completely volunteered themselves to do just that. But is this always the case with internal comms? Or is it truer to say that we often have more of a sense of obligation to go through many of the communications we receive at work? In reality, many internal comms are read, watched or listened to by people who feel duty bound to go through them. And on top of that, all the time someone's reading these comms, there's other work still to be done, nagging away at the back of their minds. Which means at least some of these communications may be interrupting them. Right from the start then, the audience's emotional setup is likely to be quite different from that of an external audience. So right from the off, it's likely that an internal audience could often be far more susceptible to switching off from a communication because they never really volunteered themselves to receive it in the first place. And this becomes particularly important when we take the next dynamic into account. Let's say the guy we're looking at here has no children and has chosen to sit through this commercial break, in the middle of which is an ad for disposable nappies. Now, he's clearly not in the market for this product, so chances are he's going to say to himself, albeit unconsciously, this ad isn't talking to me, so I don't need to pay attention to it. In short, even though he can still see and hear the communication, he'll be unconsciously opting out of the audience. But of course, an external audience's time comes for free, so it's therefore okay if many of the people who see an external communication choose to opt out, if it was never intended for them anyway. But does that approach work with internal communications? Well, sometimes it does. If, for example, there were a communication about new car parking arrangements for employees, it would be perfectly okay for people who walk to work or catch the train to opt out of the audience. However, suppose the subject related to brand delivery or a non-discretionary issue such as health and safety. Clearly, it's not always okay to have employees unconsciously deciding this isn't talking to me, so I don't need to pay attention to it. Sadly, however, an alarmingly high proportion of internal comms can generate exactly that response. And it gets even worse because every time you receive a communication on a given subject which turns out to be irrelevant to you, you'll not only have had your time wasted, you'll know it too. And if you receive a second communication on that same subject, which is equally useless to you, what are the chances you'll even bother with the third or fourth when they come along? So if the fifth communication on that subject happens to be relevant and necessary for you to act on, will you be even bothering to look at it by that stage? Communications that cry wolf don't just waste audience time, they can actually cause internal communication failures further down the line, and with that, brand delivery failure too. And it all means that in addition to these triggers being more likely to affect an internal audience than an external one, when they do so, the damage they can cause will likely be that much greater. And it gets even more challenging because of the relationship dynamic. With external communications, the relationship between communicator and audience is usually clean and simple. In essence, it's a case of we, the business, are talking to you, the customer, about this, the proposition. It's pretty much always the case that the communication comes from the business. But if we try that with internal comms, we'll often end up with a situation which sounds like this. We, the organization, are talking to you, the organization, about us, the organization. And this is only one of the ways in which just one of the 6 linguistic triggers can cause problems. There are many, many others. So it can often be much harder for internal audiences to be clear about whether or not they're being spoken to, which means the likelihood of them becoming confused and switching off is much greater than it could ever be for an external audience. So when dealing with internal communication, we have a situation in which the audience is more susceptible of being switched off by these triggers, where there will likely be greater brand damage if they're switched off, and where the triggers are far more likely to be present. Importantly though, we can use these insights not only to improve internal communication, but potentially external comms too, by helping to smooth the way when it comes to getting them approved and signed off. Let's just think about this for a moment. When someone is approving a communication, from which position will they be doing so? Communicator, audience, or detached observer? The truth is, We don't know, and chances are that consciously neither do the people doing the approving. After all, there is no absolutely right position to adopt as such. However, let's just do a little thought experiment here and imagine that a communication is being signed off by 3 people. And let's also imagine that one of those people is doing so from the communicator position, one from the audience position, and the third person is doing so as a detached observer. This is perfectly possible. So, what are the chances they'll all have the same emotional gut reactions to the words in front of them? Interesting, is it not? And even more interesting is the fact that the positions people adopt represent just one of 5 unconscious processes they can use in numerous different ways, each of which can affect those gut reactions to what they're reading. Is it any wonder the approvals process can so often get stuck? So, getting to grips with the detached observer phenomenon is not only vital for the internal communication briefing process and copywriting standards, it can also be of huge benefit to the approvals process too, and not only for internal comms but external communications as well. So, understanding the detached observer phenomenon is important for anyone involved in producing high-profile business communications, and absolutely vital when those communications are internal.